our Dante Fest. Dante did, and now high and low. Dante had much to say about his world, and his first readers thought of the Divine Comedy as an encyclopedia because the poem is so all-encompassing. The expansiveness of the Divine Comedy is what attracts so many readers to Dante in his time, throughout the ages, and certainly now. And we're going to see just how productive the Divine Comedy is in the broad and rich array of talks we'll be hearing today. We're going to be hearing about Dante's history, Dante's Islam, how Dante has been adapted on TV and film, some of the great artistic renditions of the poem from the Italian Renaissance. We're going to talk on Roberto Benigni's wildly successful recitations of the poem in Italy, talk on teaching of Dante in high schools, and why we should be reading Paradiso. We're going to end with a student performance of Dante, so without much further ado, my colleague Adrian Ward will introduce the first set of speakers.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm happy to welcome you to the first session of today's symposium, New Media and New Audiences. As Deborah just said, you'll hear some wonderful papers, and we'll listen to the papers first and then have questions and answers afterward. Our first speaker is Dwayne Osheim. Dwayne received his PhD from the University of California at Davis. He has been a fellow of the American Academy in Rome, and his interests in the social and cultural history of late medieval and Renaissance Italy have resulted in these books, among several others. The Social World of an Italian Monastery, San Michele of Guamo. Beyond Florence, The Contours of Medieval and Early Modern Italy. Chronicling History, Chroniclers and Historians in Medieval and Renaissance Italy. Dwayne officially retired last May as full professor, and after having served as Associate Dean for Graduate Study and Chair of the Department of History. His talk today grows in part out of a popular course on Dante's Italy that he has co-taught several times in the last few years with Deborah Parker. Did I mention that Dwayne is retired? Dante calls him back to speak to us today on Dante's arrival in the history of Italy.
It is good to be back, I have to say. I hope you were able to come to the sessions yesterday afternoon and hear Mark and Deborah talk about Dante in popular American literature, to see sections of the films that have been made that Paul Cantor introduced, and we'll talk more about this this afternoon. You begin to see all the ways that art historians, literary critics, cultural analysts can work with Dante. And knowing that before we started, that they could talk so well and eloquently about literature, about popular culture, I was really at a loss to think about what it was I could add to this story. But finally, I did recall one visit to Italy when I was staying with some friends. This was 3 generations living in an old rambling villa between Lucca and the sea. And one night my friend brought home a gift for his nephew. He brought the 3 volumes of the Divine Comedy. Picchio, that was his nickname. Picchio was overcome by the gift. He was a teenager and certainly no intellectual, but he was overjoyed to have his own copy of Dante. And I began to understand just then the kind of hold Dante has on Italian culture. And that hold was understood on a recent visit to Italy when I was watching all over TV the series of ads for Team. That's the Italian Telecom's mobile phone division. The commercials are, I thought, Italy's version of the Geico ads. You know, those ads featuring nursery rhymes where you hear the woodsman complain about woodchucks chucking wood, or you hear the piggy going wee, wee, wee all the way home. Well, the Italian ads are different. But they imagined Italy's history if Team's cell phone had been part of the story. All the ads begin, the history of Italy according to Team. There's one that I finally ran across with Julius Caesar on a cell phone chatting up a girlfriend and urging her, carpe diem. And then there's another showing Garibaldi in a strategy session with maps all over the place. And suddenly he's interrupted on his cell phone. His mother is calling, a mamoni. And then there was this. Oops, we lost the sound. We'll try it again. There we go.
Nel mezzo del cammino di nostra vita, mi ritrovo una città oscura. La vittoria era smarrita, senza credito per chiedere aiuto.
Dante!
Virgilio!
Ma passati! Era il mio mestiere.
Ti assegno a mesi, pensavo. Beatrice! Sì, però io martedì c'ho calcetto,
There it is. Dante's lost in a dark woods with no cell phone reception. Dante switched to Team, Virgil says, and so quickly he's back in contact with Beatrice. The ads are very popular. And if you go to YouTube, Paul Cantor mentioned the thing you can see on YouTube, but if you go to YouTube and look for Team, T-I-M, and Dante, or just look for Team, you can find these versions as well as some quite hilarious outtakes. But the point of both of these reminiscences is that Dante continues to exert a powerful influence on Italian society. I don't really think there's an equivalent in American life, perhaps not in English life. In fact, there's no equivalent to this in Europe. This is Italy's version of the €2 coin with an image of Dante. And so far as I know, no other country in the Eurozone uses a literary figure on a coin. So, all of this, of course, affects how Dante appears in popular culture and in popular fiction, as we see here. Now, I'll concede real analysis to the others, but I did notice while reading Dan Brown's Inferno that references to Dante form a kind of, well, I have to disagree somewhat with Deborah from yesterday, but they're like a kind of patina. They're like the descriptions of the Uffizi Gallery or of San Marco. They're a kind of padding that always need to be explained and that almost seem to interrupt the action. And the action itself, in a lot of respects, seems more like a description of the scene that Tom Hanks is expected to play in the movie version. Now, this may be a little bit unfair, but I found myself comparing it to an Italian historical novel, which would be called in English, The Secret Codex of Dante. Now, in this novel, the characters emerge from the comedy. The hero and heroine are shadowy figures mentioned by Dante or by Dante scholars. They're named, but they're never further identified. There are Florentine magnates, there are haughty churchmen, there are literary lights that emerge in a mystery that really brings to light Dante's Italy. The author, Francesco Fioretti, is quite aware of Dan Brown's success with the Da Vinci Code. But unlike Brown, he takes his readers into the complexities and the mysteries of late medieval life. Now, perhaps he hoped that his novel would succeed much as Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose succeeded in English. But frankly, it would be a tough sell. Dante just does not mean the same things in this country that he does in Italy. Dante and his reputation remain one of the touchstones with which Italians reason about their world. In the time that remains, I'd like to give you a few examples of Dante's place, or maybe Dante's arrival, in the history of Italy. And in the process, I hope you'll come to understand why Dante is on the euro, and why the Team ads are as popular as they are. Now, the Divine Comedy was an immediate hit. Boccaccio, among others, wrote commentaries and lectured on the comedy. By the 16th century, it was said that the commentary or the comedy was second only to the Bible in Florentine public libraries. But Dante and the comedy were part of a polemic over language. First, why the vernacular and not Latin? Again, Paul Cantor mentioned this yesterday. And secondly, what is the true Italian vernacular? Now, humanists initially complained about the comedy and said it would have been greater if it had been written in Latin. Now, there seem to be two reasons they didn't like the vernacular. The first was that being in the vernacular, it meant that common laborers could be heard singing and reciting the immortal lines. And this is true. Public singers, the cantastorie, used the comedy as well as local history, religious and political prophecies, when they sang their songs in piazzas like Santa Croce. The cantastorie played an undervalued role in the transmission of culture. If the masses knew the comedy, and it seems that they really did, it was in large measure because of these popular buskers. This angered the humanists, who thought that great poetry should not be a thing of the masses. In the 15th century, they also thought Dante erred, because according to their theories, Italian was a spoken language, while Latin was written. This, they thought, had always been the case. Humanists assumed that, that ancient Romans like Cicero must have spoken Italian, even as they wrote their orations in Latin. So initially, humanists didn't really recognize that language could change, that it could have a history. But for these humanists, there were other problems. By the 16th century, Dante, like his near contemporaries, Petrarch, Boccaccio, was part of a debate about just over what was proper Italian. Non-Florentines like the Venetian Pietro Bembo thought that the three great Florentines were exemplars of a more general, elevated Italian and not just elevated Florentine. So it was a language shared by other learned people throughout Italy. Florentines, and especially the Grand Dukes of Tuscany, thought that the best Italian was Florentine, and particularly Florentine as spoken on the streets of Florence. Now this wasn't simply a literary argument, kind of like the comic arguments you can hear to this day in places like Genoa, Milan, or Rome, about whose Italian really is the most elegant. Lingua Toscana and Bocca Romana, sort of Tuscan spoken by a Roman. I remember hearing that all the time when we lived in Rome. And in fact, there was this one art historian who made a lovely joke. He was giving a lecture to a bunch of Americans, and he said, well, maybe in fact the best Italian is Lingua Toscana and Bocca Americana. We weren't that silly. We weren't that stupid. We didn't believe him. But anyway, he was having a joke with us. And it was a very common joke that people had who spoke the best Italian. But the Medici dukes understood the debate over language, like discussions of art and learning, to be part of a larger claim, their claims for political and cultural predominance in 16th century Italy. Now remember, in 16th century Italy, much of Italy was controlled by the kings of Spain, and it was not really a clear sense of how the various parts of Italy fit together. Now eventually, the Florentines do produce a dictionary designed to preserve their vernacular. A dictionary based on the language, again, of Dante of the 14th century, the language of Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch. So if you go to Alderman, you'll find the dictionary, called the Vocabolario, of the Accademia dell'Etrusca in the reference room. And of course, you can also find it online. Now, things for Dante did change later. He seemed to be less important later in the 16th century and the 17th century, during the Counter-Reformation and even in the Enlightenment. Paul IV had added Dante's book on monarchy to his list of prohibited books. The Divine Comedy wasn't on the list, but many clerics remained suspicious of portions of the comedy, because of course Dante did put a number of popes in hell, and some of his views did seem heterodox. Other critics, like the great historian Ludovico Antonio Muratori, could praise Dante's poetry, the earlier works, but like the humanists, he found parts of the comedy too earthy, too common, to be worthy of praise or emulation. The scenes of filth, the coarse language, and even the obscene gestures seemed to the learned historian and reformer unworthy of praise. Now, more broadly in the Enlightenment, many found the text to be too religious, that it was too caught up in the affairs of a town no longer thought to be particularly important. They generally agreed with Voltaire, who commented, quote, "No one in Europe reads Dante anymore because it's little more than allusion to obscure facts." But things were to change. Dante was about to again arrive in the history of Italy. The balance of power in Italy was shattered during the French Revolution by the French invasion of 1797. So Republican reformers, anti-clericals, nationalists all believed Italy could change radically and profoundly. In the wake of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, Italy, like other parts of Europe, was caught up in a revival of national patriotism. A united Italy did come, of course, first with in a battle with the Austro-Hungarians, then driving out the Bourbon kings of Naples. Then all but Rome belonged to a united Italy. Now, Massimo d'Azeglio famously remarked at this point, in the middle of the 19th century, "We have made Italy, now we must make Italians." And making Italians was a process which had already begun before the actual unification. It had begun early and right after the French Revolution. And this again is where Dante enters the history of Italy. In Italy, there has been a long and still uncompleted debate over just what it is to be Italian. Modern critics often conclude that Italy is an imagined community, a place where people with little in common, actually in common, were connected only by myths. Geographically and economically, of course, the North and South are like different countries. And of course, for some separatists, they are different countries. And linguistically, the 19th and the 20th centuries for Italy has seemed like a conjuring of dialects and local feelings. Carlo Levi once described a southern village so isolated that it was the outsiders who were called Christians, because they said, even Christ stopped at Aboli, just across the mountains from the village. Patriots certainly wanted a united Italy, but realists, like Austro-Hungarian Chancellor in the 19th century, Clemens von Metternich, dismissed those dreams. They dismissed Italy itself as being just a geographical term. To many patriots, it was literature that could make it more. Famously, Joshua Carducci noted, he said, when Prince Metternich said that Italy was a mere geographical expression, he missed the point. It was a literary expression, a poetical tradition. And so we begin to guess where Dante is going to fit here. And interestingly, in the feverish debates over Italy and how people wrote about Dante, the ideas changed. Many still praised his poetry, but in many respects, his life became more important. In many respects, Dante became a prophet of unification. Italy had been divided among foreign powers, the monarchs of French origin in Naples, the Pope in Rome, the Austro-Hungarians through much of the rest of Italy. One example of how Italians thought about this literary expression was provided by Giacomo Leopardi, perhaps Italy's greatest romantic poet. He heard rumors in 1818 that there was to be a new statue of Dante created in Florence, a project that actually goes back to the time of Boccaccio when he first tried to get a memorial to Dante, this in the 14th century. Now, this statue was actually only completed in the 1860s, but the rumor of a statue was enough for Leopardi. He wrote about what Dante could mean. The statue will be ennobling, he said, for Florence and for all of Italy. Recollection and celebration of Dante and his work will bring solace to a luckless Italy. Italy, he said, suffered from foreign domination. Quote, Italian wives in the arms of barbarians. He means, of course, the French. Divine works of Italian art, of Italian artists, carted across the Alps. And of course, it's true, Napoleon did fill Parisian museums with art and even religious works. Like others, Leopardi hoped that a new Dante, a new prophet, would emerge and bring about a more just and a more independent Italy. And this is part of his poem. If only pity for Italy, whose glory excelled all others, came alive in those who love her and can save her, exhausted and lethargic as she is. From such an abysmal darkness, he said, if only this could happen. He said, glorious spirit, and here he means Dante, tell me, has your love for Italy died? Has the fire that gave you life gone cold? Will she never rise again? And this is typical then of the spirit that you begin to find in the 19th century as they talked about Dante especially. So Leopardi, Alfieri, Carducci, and other nationalists thought that Dante was the model of cultural and civic virtues that could create the united Italy. He preached civic virtues and he criticized political excess. Even Italian Marxists in the 19th century proclaimed Dante the first modern. Other secularists celebrated him as an anti-papal people who supported the papacy, a strong papacy, a predominant papacy in Italy. The Ghibellines favored a secular power, first the Holy Roman Emperor, but a united Italy not under the control of the papacy. And terms like neo-Guelph, in fact, continue to be used in the 20th century in certain kinds of political debate. So these are powerful terms. So when they talk about him as an anti-papal Ghibelline, it's strong language. And like Carducci, the nationalists believed that it was Dante and Italy's literary culture that could be a basis for Italian unity. Now, in May of 1865, 50,000 or more Italians made a pilgrimage to Florence to commemorate Dante's birth. That's the time that this statue shows up. Remember that just 5 years earlier, the unification of central and northern Italy had taken place. Further, the capital of Italy had been moved from the north, from Piedmont, Sardinia, to Florence. Florence, it seemed, was then the political as well as the cultural capital of Italy. And there was a tidal wave of bad mythical poetry and writing about Dante. As part of the celebration of Dante in the 1860s, a man named Carlo del Balso published a book which in English would be called The Poetry of 1,000 Authors on Dante. And this ran 15 volumes, mostly bad, but 15 volumes nonetheless. Dante, as a cult figure, would continue to grow. In 1900, there was a commemoration of the Vision. Remember, it's 1300, Holy Week 1300, that the Great Journey takes place. So in 1900, there was another kind of commemoration. Then, in 1921, there was a commemoration of Dante's death. Now, there was a second, more scholarly celebration of Dante, but in many respects, this begins not with the Italians, but with outsiders. You could think of the Englishman Paget Toynbee, whose Dante dictionary, again, is something you can find in the reference room in the library. There's a German Robert Davidson, and others who were drawn to the study of Dante and his age. Remember, well, the pre-Raphaelite movement in Victorian literature. Dante Gabriele Rossetti, whose actual given name, of course, was Gabriel, and he only became Dante Gabriele when he started publishing. But he translated Dante as well as other medieval Italian poets into English. Now, Italian scholars, too, participated in the editing and the study of Dante. And as they did, they criticized those 1,000 authors that I mentioned earlier. They criticized the popular celebration of the myth of Dante, what they called Dantephilia, or Dantologia, or one guy called it Dantomania in English. But the scholarly concern never really effectively muted the popular feeling for Dante, the Ghibelline prophet of a united Italy. Were there time, we could go on and talk more about Dante in the 20th century. But the point to take away here is that the image of Dante it really is extremely powerful in Italian public life. Nationalists and fascists in the 20th century both could celebrate Dante. Catholics, and in fact, they do, if you again, are trolling around the web and look up Dante and Liceo, the Italian word for high school, you will find all sorts of things written by literature teachers explaining why it is we should study Dante. And the Catholic schools would talk about how important it was to study Dante, that they could ignore the anti-papal feeling and celebrate the Christian vision. And then those who saw culture as the only possible glue holding Italian society together could celebrate the breadth and the power of his writing. And of course, that's part of the debate we'll hear about this afternoon when we hear about the public recitations of Dante that have been so popular in the 21st century. And as I say, I think this continues today. Dante is a staple of secondary education. You'll find Liceo's name for other lights of Italian culture, but a quick look at the web shows that Dante was by far the most common figure to use in naming a school. And this is true throughout Italy, not just Tuscany. And of course, he's a staple of the education offered there in those licei. Both in the classical and in the scientific high schools, everybody reads Dante. This then, as I say, is how Dante arrived in the history of Italy. We might want to turn it around now and think about what would Dante notice about history or Italy in the 20th or the 21st centuries. First of all, Dante, of course, remains a way for Italians to reason about themselves, about their values and their culture. That's one reason, as I say that the Roberto Benigni recitations are so popular. How Italians treat Dante and the Divine Comedy says a lot about their world and what makes their world. But Dante, on the other hand, would probably applaud the idea of united Italy. At first I was going to say the Italian state, but even Dante, in his most powerful, probably couldn't praise the Italian state. But he would applaud the idea of a united state. In the comedy and in his later writings on the empire, he argued that an empire, or a state, or an external power, with greater force than the city-state, a city-state like Florence, could control the military, could allow for civil peace, and could end the exile of people like himself. The Italian government, of course, has its own problems, but it is better than the violence and the exile that Dante had known in the 14th century. Dante also would probably applaud the political powerlessness of the papacy. Yet the idea of a pope isolated in the Vatican, a prisoner of the Vatican, is it Pius IX? It is Pius IX. The first says, I'm a prisoner of the Vatican. The idea of a pope isolated in the Vatican would be better than the warrior popes he'd known in the 13th and 14th centuries. Dante and other late medieval critics of the church argued that Jesus and the apostles had not owned property, and they couldn't claim, or they didn't claim, actual political power. Of course, in the 14th century, this was thought to be radical, even heretical. Dante would applaud Pope Francis, who has rejected the trappings of power and prefers to be a moral exemplar. But finally, Dante would probably be uncomfortable with much of what we're saying here today, and with our understanding of religion. Dante would want to remind us what Dan Brown has forgotten, or maybe just finds unimportant, that the comedy is a story of religious conversion. It's a story making clear, to his mind, how difficult it is to be a Christian and to live as a Christian in the world. And of course, this is an observation that 21st century Christians ought to recognize. Dante would probably agree with them that there is a cost to discipleship. But Christian or not, Dante's narrative of religion, of heaven and hell, doesn't really resonate for us the way Dante would have wanted or expected. So perhaps in ending this talk, we should give the last word to our social critics from Team.
Beatrice, penso io.
Beatrice, è tu che sia la pessima affluenza. Te la risparmiami, ciao.
Continui a essere sì. E oggi abbiamo 100 subito a 12 euro al mese per sempre.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Sarah Annunziato. Sarah currently teaches in the Italian program at UVA. She received her PhD in Italian from the Johns Hopkins University in 2007 and a BA in Italian and Government from Smith College in 2000. Her current research interests include Italian children's literature and television, crime fiction in Italy, film adaptation and the Italian cinematic tradition, and the representation of Italy in American cinema and mass media. Sarah's articles have appeared in the Journal of Children and Media, the Historical Journal of Film, Radio, and Television, La Rivista di Studi Italiani, and Annali Italianistica. While at the University of Virginia, she's taught courses on film adaptation, Italian children's literature, Italo-American relations from the colonial era to the present, and Italian political theory. She also currently edits La Vendemmia, the newsletter of Italian studies at the University of Virginia, and along with her students, regularly collaborates with the syndicated Italian radio show, Caffè Italia. Please welcome Sarah and her thoughts on Dante in primetime, references to the Inferno on American television.
Good morning. I want to talk to you a little bit today on how Dante is utilized in television. and I'm not sure how exactly this go forward. On January 10, 1997, a family of mobsters and their associates entered American living rooms for the first time via the small screen. This date marked the premiere of HBO's acclaimed series, The Sopranos. According to the television critic Brett Martin, it also marked the dawn of a third golden age of American television. This third golden age corresponds to our present era and follows previous golden ages of the 1950s when the medium was new, and the 1980s when network television enjoyed a flower of high-quality productions such as Hill Street Blues and St. Elsewhere, among other offerings. According to Martin, a reliance on either hour-long serialized dramas or 30-minute serialized comedies centering on deeply flawed protagonists characterizes the present golden age. During this period, we find a proliferation of programming focused on characters whose flaws range from the typical, such as the relationship columnist, who ironically cannot make any of her own relationships work, to the extreme, like the mobster who suffers from acute depression and anxiety. In the midst of this golden age, many shows also feature guest appearances from a 14th century Italian poet, Dante Alighieri. These appearances consist of allusions to the first volume of Dante's masterpiece, The Divine Comedy. To be sure, what we are viewing are not adaptations of Dante's great work in the traditional sense, nor are they what the film scholar Jeffrey Wagner would term analogies, or works that use the inverno as a foundation for entirely new narratives. Rather, we see examples of television shows that include some type of reference to the structure of Dante's Hell, particular textual episodes, or the poem in a general sense. So they're like quotations, kind of. These references to the inferno provide the viewer with a greater understanding of the television character's psychologies, while suggesting how each character's mental state may drive feature plots. It is the purpose of this presentation to explore this phenomenon by briefly examining how American programming of the Third Golden Age tends to utilize the illusions in general, and then to discuss the specific case of AMC's Mad Men. However, before delving into any of that, let's first consider why Dante's comedy lends itself so well to the medium of television in the first place. In his essay, Dante, Television, and Education, Iannucci concludes that the Divine Comedy's preeminent textual characteristics closely resemble those of television. Drawing the criteria enumerated by John Fiske and John Hartley, Iannucci concludes that Dante's comedy embodies many qualities that are typical of oral communication. That is an important observation, for as McLuhan states of television in his famous book, Understanding Media, it changed the notion of how we read. McLuhan says, quote, "The old literate habit of racing ahead on uniform lines of print yielded suddenly to depth reading. Reading in depth is, of course, not proper to the printed word. As such, depth probing of words and language is a normal feature of oral and manuscript cultures rather than of print," unquote. Therefore, both television and the Divine Comedy are texts that rely on a high degree of this orality. Furthermore, as Iannucci notes, this orality creates a poem in fiere, where the reader feels as though the next section has yet to happen, even when you know it's already been written. In this way, Dante's work is also similar to the concept of the televised serial. In serialized television, each episode of a particular season stands as its own work and therefore may center on specific plot points and characters. However, all individual episodes fit together as part of an ongoing story. This lends an illusion of open-endedness to the serial. We think it's never going to stop, even though we know at some point it has to. In the case of Dante's text, each canto corresponds to an episode that forms part of the ongoing story arc of every individual cantico. The cantiche together, in turn, resemble each season of a three-season-long television program. In addition to these structural characteristics, Dante's work shares another important similarity with televisual text. As the poet himself makes clear in his letter to Congrande, the Divine Comedy is polysemous. As Fiske notes, this quality is also a trait inherent to television. Finally, like television, which is designed to tell stories that are accessible to a wider audience, as Dante states in the same letter to Congrande, he chooses to pen his poem in the vernacular, which he describes as, quote, "the low language that even women talk," end quote. Of course, this somewhat crude description leads us to understand that the poet wishes for it to be accessible to a greater number of people, and not just to those who read Latin. As a result of all these parallels between Dante's work and the medium of television itself, the poem's allure for television writers appears more understandable. During the third golden age of American television, that allure attracted writers to the inferno almost immediately. The allusions that we can associate with Dante's text begin with The Sopranos around 2002. It is during this season of the mafia drama that the episode Whoever Did This aired. This particular installment of the show focuses on Uncle Junior's trial and RICO charges. In a mildly humorous moment, a journalist covering the proceedings reports that earlier in the day, a boom microphone had struck Uncle Junior and knocked him down 9 steps. This references the circles of Dante's hell, and two in particular, that correspond with sins that we know Uncle Junior has committed. Violence, because he's ordered hits on many people, and treachery, because he has attempted to kill his nephew. The circles of hell make another cameo in 2006 during the episode entitled Join the Club. Here, the show's protagonist, Tony Soprano, lies in a coma after a dementia-addled Junior has shot him. While unconscious, Tony has a dream about being on a business trip on the West Coast when he accidentally switches briefcases and wallets with a man named Kevin Finnerty. Left with no money or credit cards, Tony checks into a hotel room under Finnerty's name. The room he receives is number 728. Once again, each number corresponds to one of Tony's many sins committed throughout the series: violence, lust, and fraud. Later, while taking the stairs in lieu of a broken elevator, Tony stumbles and falls, landing on the 5th floor, or the level of the raffle, another of the character's flaws. These types of references serve to remind the viewer that while the show does explore its characters' more humane sides, each of them ultimately have a darker or more dangerous side that more often than not wins out. In the end, the suggestion is that redemption through personal growth will most likely not come. If you think of the way the series ends with the dark screen where it suggests that he's not really moving forward into something better, kind of suggests there's no possibility of real redemption for him. The show Angel also uses the system of Dante's hell towards a similar effect. In the episode A New World, Lila, Devious lawyer, gives Wexley with a copy of Dante's Inferno. They engage in a brief discussion of the Ninth Circle, more specifically of who Satan is munching on when Dante finally sees him. Lila has come to offer Wexley a job in her firm, which he refuses on moral principles. However, her parting words to him, quote, "The worst spot in hell is reserved for those who betray, so don't pretend you're too good for us," unquote, hints at his past mistakes. He has betrayed those closest to him on 2 previous occasions, both when he turned against his former colleagues on the Watchers Council to save a woman he loved, and later when he kidnaps Angel's infant son to save the baby through a prophecy, only to allow Angel's enemies to subsequently